Media observers say that the press freedom situation in Africa is worrying. Newspaper, radio and TV stations are facing complete challenge from authorities as authorities clamp down on them with impunity. Some journalists are presently languishing in jail for just doing their work, while those that are free work under precarious conditions. The World Press Freedom Day coming up on the 3rd of May is focused on journalism under siege. In this edition of the program, we shall explore the impact of digital checks on freedom of expression, as well as the role of the state and media groups in surmounting prevailing press freedom challenges. Stay with us. Our guest is a media activist whose love for press freedom knows no bounds. Her pulse alone is powered by the insatiable quest for the protection of journalists in Africa and across the world. Before joining the Committee to Protect Journalists in 2016, she had a rich career in South Africa's major print media landscape, working for The Witness, The Mercury, and The Mail and Guardian. She is the former Secretary General of the South African National Editors Forum and was presidential correspondent during the mandate of President Nelson Mandela in South Africa. Her role as the African Programs Coordinator of the Committee to Protect Journalists merges her two vocations, that is journalism as well as human rights. She is none other than Angela Quintal, the African Programs Coordinator of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Angela Quintal, thank you very much for talking to Dash News, especially on the program In Depth. We are indeed very happy to be with you.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Yeah, once again, the world will be observing the World Press Freedom Day on the 3rd of May 2022, like every other year. As we look forward to this day, what can you say is the state of press freedom on the African continent?
Well, Peter, I wish I could say to you that there's good news, but I'm afraid that there isn't. I mean, largely we have seen a deterioration in the environment over the years, and I guess the usual culprits are those that you see on our annual prison census of jailed journalists. We have Egypt, we have Ethiopia, we have Rwanda, Eritrea, and of course Cameroon up there in the top 5. And that, of course, is just a reflection of the number of jailed journalists, but we've also seen an increase in the number of journalists who've been killed. Certainly the highest number last year, at least 6 that we've been able to confirm, was because of their journalism. The last time we had such a big figure was in 2015, so it just shows how things have in fact deteriorated. And then, of course, we have, the use of cybercrime legislation against journalists. We have surveillance, we have digital surveillance, we have assaults on journalists covering protests and also covering elections. So I'm afraid I'd like to sit here and say to you that things are looking good, but they're not. And I think one of the biggest disappointments for us, and I think for many, many people, including in Ethiopia itself, is what has happened in Ethiopia. That initial reform that we saw after Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came into power, when in fact on World Press Freedom Day in Addis Ababa 3 years ago, when he was able to say that there weren't any journalists in jail for the first time in years, I mean a mere 3 years later, and Ethiopia is the second worst jailer of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa. Our revised figures show that there were 14 journalists in jail. Mostly were arrested after the state of emergency was declared in Ethiopia in November. Now that it has been lifted, we still have at least 2 journalists in jail. The others have been released, but some of them are facing charges.
All right. Now, despite the efforts of bodies like the Committee to Protect Journalists, Journalists Without Borders, as well as other associations, we still find that there's a lot of impunity against journalists. Why do you think that the malpractice continues to persist, despite the work and the effort and the sweat that you and other activists are putting through to protect journalists?
It's simple, really. I mean, there just is a lack of political will amongst authorities. There's just no accountability. And so often what you're seeing, of course, is that government itself is actually behind the murders of journalists. And even when the perpetrators are known, there's not necessarily the appetite to ensure that they are brought to justice. You know, we have the thing called the International Day for Impunity in Crimes Against Journalists, and that's every year on November the 2nd. It's a United Nations recognized day. So it's all very well having these, but when the will is not there, actions speak louder than words. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that governments are prepared to find those who murder journalists and to hold them accountable. I look at Ghana, for example, the great investigative journalist Ahmed Swal Devela, who was killed, was murdered a couple of years back. We still don't have anyone arrested for his murder. I must say, however, that where we have seen, the countries dropping the ball in terms of their own journalists, something that is pretty heartening and that we have seen just this week is that in Germany, the Germans are actually trying someone for the murder of a journalist in the Gambia. And this person happens to be someone who fled to Germany. And the Germans are using universal jurisdiction because they believe that what this person did, they were part of a hit squad of the then President Yahya Jammeh. They were involved in various murders, including the murder of Dada Hadara. And they've been held, the Germans are able to hold this person accountable. So it's in a jurisdiction outside of Gambia, but at least where the locals are not able to do anything, the long arm of the law, which is the international arm of the law, is actually able to move against them. The other good news, I think, if we don't always want bad news, but if I look at the murder of a famous journalist called Norbert Zongo in Burkina Faso, just last year, the French authorities actually ruled that the alleged murder, the brother of the former president, Francois Compaoré, is the brother of Blaise Compaoré. Yeah. He was the one that was seen as being involved in the murder, and there was an attempt to extradite him. So again, what I'm trying to say, Peter, is that while people may think that they escaped the law in their own countries, in terms of the international pressure, there is always a way to hold people accountable for murder.
All right. Now, I would like us to look at the case in Cameroon. As per the report produced by the Committee to Protect Journalists on the 1st of December, that was last year, Cameroon had 6 journalists in jail, making the country the 4th worst jailer of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa. What reading do you make of Cameroon's position in that particular ranking?
So Cameroon is really a major disappointment, because one would have hoped that there would be a situation where the Cameroonian government would appreciate that a democratic media and independent, diverse media is important for a democratic state to function. And so over the years, and particularly post-2016, at the end of 2016, when we saw the start of the Anglophone crisis, what we have seen is a crackdown on the press, a major crackdown. We've seen the use of anti-terror legislation against journalists, and we have also seen the use of cybercrime and false news laws. At the very moment, we now have 5 journalists in jail. There was a journalist released late in December, but there are still 5 journalists in jail. And there are journalists who are being prosecuted. So just even today, there was a journalist in court on a criminal defamation charge. His name is Malcolm Paho. And we've just found out that the case was postponed because the complainant actually wants him to face false news charges as well. So the fact that there is a criminalization of the practice of journalism itself in Cameroon is of great concern. And we've asked repeatedly for these journalists to be released, for crimes that are press crimes to be decriminalized. I know that there are some members of parliament in Cameroon who are looking at this very issue. Unfortunately, they're mostly from the opposition. They do not involve the ruling party. But I do hope that somehow you will see the decriminalization of press offenses in Cameroon.
All right, Angela, one of the issues that has continued to generate lots of attention is the case of Samuel Wazizi. Wazizi was declared by the Cameroonian army of having died from severe sepsis, but press organizations like yours and other bodies have a contrary view that he may have died from torture following his arrest by the police in Buea in the southwest region of the country. So far, are you pleased with the declaration of the Cameroonian army concerning the case of Samuel Wazizi? And we have also witnessed some drawback by organizations. Why has there been a little bit of silence on the issue since then?
Well, there certainly hasn't been silence, and I can certainly say definitely not. The Committee to Protect Journalists is not satisfied. In fact, one of Samuel Wazizi's last words when he was still in police custody before he was handed over to the military was this. He said, "Don't let me die in here." Okay, that was his last words to a friend before he was then handed over to the military. And it is CPJ's duty, and we will continue to ensure that we fight to find out what happened to Samuel Wazizi. The fact that it took 10 months for the military to announce that he had died in custody is already a sign that something was terribly wrong. The fact that the military lied and said that his body had been waiting for the family to come and collect it when the family had not ever been informed of him having died, that already is a sign. I mean, CPJ was central and party to various efforts to ensure that we get to the bottom of this, even when we thought that he had disappeared in the system and that he was still alive. We were party to efforts to ensure that there was, at least through the courts, an attempt to ensure that we could be told where he was held. The application was a habeas corpus application, and there were at least 2 of those before suddenly the military claimed that he had died and had done so, had died 10 months earlier. So what are we doing? We have to ensure that in terms of the domestic laws in the country, that we are able to exhaust all those avenues before we can actually move to the international sphere and ask the international courts and the international community to take action. So COVID has certainly made a bit of has certainly scuppered things in the sense that the courts weren't sitting and so on. But there is still an attempt to exhaust the domestic legal avenues in Cameroon. The lawyers are still busy with that case. What we need is an independent inquiry. And what we also need is an independent autopsy, because there has to be justice for Wazizi. And that is what we're pushing for. And as I tried to explain earlier, the important thing is that no one can hide from wrongdoing, because if the domestic laws do not assist, there is always the international laws and the international community that can move forward. And this is what we've seen in Germany. And I'm sure that if we don't get the answer from the Cameroonian government, that there will be international repercussions in international through international jurisdiction.
All right, so you are confirming right here on In-Depth on Dash News that the Wazizi affair is not yet over as far as the Committee to Protect Journalists is concerned?
Definitely not. I mean, even for me personally, I have said, and I have been in contact with his family and his lawyers, this is not something that I'm going to let go, because this was something that clearly just showed how the military and others are beyond the scope of decency, that there was absolutely nothing that they were prepared to do to inform anyone, including the lawyers and in the courts, to say that he had died a mere 10 days after he'd been handed over to the military by the police. Why did it take 10 months? So all of that points to the fact that there's something fishy here, and it is our job, all of us, journalists in Cameroon, all freedom-loving people, to ensure that Samuel Bouazizi does not die, not only in terms of the physically, but that his memory is not going to die with people just giving up and moving on. That is something that we won't countenance.
All right. Now, from Cameroon, you cited Egypt, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Cameroon as the worst jailers of journalists in Africa, with others like Eritrea going as far as killing journalists. But particularly focused on West Africa, where within the past 2 years, we have seen an unprecedented number of coups d'etats in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso. An attempted coup happened also in Guinea-Bissau. Is the Committee to Protect Journalists concerned about the state of press freedom in these countries, which are now being held by the military junta?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you see military coups, let's just see something as basic. What happens when the military tries to take over? The one thing that they do is they try and take over the communications, and you'll see that they'll invade the public broadcaster or the state broadcaster. And then you see the censorship. And that is what we have been seeing in these countries. In the Sahel region, we certainly have been seeing that there are certain things that journalists are no longer able to write about. That they're warned about writing about the insurgency. They're warned about what they can and what they can't write. Foreign media are not allowed into the country. A good example right now is in Mali, where there is an accreditation process that has been going on for years and years, well, for months, that has supposedly stalled so that there isn't any foreign media in the country. Then you have foreign media that have effectively been banned in the country. We saw what happened with RFI. And just, a real concern, if you look at Mali, is the fact that because there has been this broken relationship with the French, we have a situation where there is a French journalist currently in Mali who was abducted over a year ago by jihadists, who we know is still alive because recently a video was made public. His name is Olivier Dubois. But the fact that the military are now more involved in trying to ensure that they hang on to power and have this problem with the French, it means that someone like Olivier is probably going to be stuck in that environment for a lot longer than would have been necessary had we had a functioning government who was prepared to uphold the basic rights of human beings. And for a journalist to be held in custody for more than a year, and with no sense that he will be freed anytime soon, is of great concern.
All right. Now, you just cited the case of Mali, particularly with the ban on RFI and France 24, which the country's media observatory this day decided to completely outlaw the 2 French stations. And like you said earlier, French authorities are raising an issue of sovereignty because they believe that the French are not working in their interest. But do you think they have the legal grounds to ban these French media organs from the country? Are there concrete reasons which you think may justify their action?
So I can't comment on whether they have legal grounds, but in terms of moral grounds, the fact is that there's something called the Windhoek Declaration. Mali is part of the United Nations. It subscribes to the conventions of the United Nations. And one of the things is that the public, actually citizens, deserve a free, diverse and pluralistic media. Why should Malian citizens be any different? You know, they should have a right to choose. If they don't want to listen to RFI, then they don't have to listen to RFI. They can listen to something else, but they should be given the choice. And governments should not be in a position where they can control the narrative for whatever reason. And this is what is happening in Mali at the moment. So as far as the Committee to Protect Journalists is concerned, it is important to have as many voices, a diversity of media as possible, and to try and close down that space for whatever reason, because there may be problems with a particular country because of whatever. You know, I mean, if you see what's happening in Mali, when you actually have other countries now coming in and also having an influence, you know, frankly, we would have no media whatsoever if that's the case. The one good thing, of course, is that you can try and shut down the airwaves, but there are always ways for citizens to get news. We're now in the digital age, so I think that it's far more difficult to try and censor than it may have been in the past.
Now, what advice can professionals in Mali and other countries that are being ruled by the military, what advice can you give them on how they need to tread at this particular time, knowing fully well, like you said, that the terrain may be extremely dangerous for them?
When you say what sort of advice, can you be a little bit more specific?
Yeah, we mean in terms of how they have to go about their work, working in that kind of very, very tense and uncertain environment.
Yeah, sure. So I think the one thing that is of great importance for CPJ is to ensure the safety of journalists. And to be honest, as a former editor myself, and I always say to my team, no story is worth killing yourself for. And so what is really important is for journalists to have the training and the understanding of ensuring that they can report safely, not only for themselves, but also for the people that they are reporting on and for their sources. So for me, there is a responsibility on journalists and newsrooms to ensure that their journalists are able to report safely in these conditions. You know, it's not only in terms of their physical security, but when we talk about the pervasive use of surveillance technology, of spyware and so on, it's important that journalists are empowered to ensure that they protect themselves and their sources in as many ways as possible. So for me, that would be the big takeaway, is to ensure that journalists operating in Mali and elsewhere where there is conflict, that they actually do ensure that they have their safety top of mind and that they are able to report as safely as possible in these conditions.
Yeah, in most African countries, there's always the adage that the media is the fourth estate, but we keep seeing a clash between the media as well as the government and other arms of government, not leaving out the legislative and the judiciary. What explains this continuous conflict between the government and the media?
So let me say, I don't think that it's only in Africa, it's the world over. And I think the issue is that for many governments actually want to control the narrative. You know, they effectively want to pull the wool over their citizens' eyes. You know, they want to remain in power at all costs. Generally, when you don't have a democracy, you will see that governments will try to shut down the press. They will try to control the press, and they're going to try and ensure that any sort of scrutiny or being held accountable is something that they try to avoid, and they're going to try and ensure that the media is subservient. And that, I think, ultimately is what we're talking about here. When you see the government clashing with the press, it's invariably because the government doesn't want the public to know certain things. And ultimately, and I say this all the time, when we talk about press freedom, we're not talking about press freedom because we're only worried about journalists. The issue of press freedom is ultimately because it is a corollary to the public, to the citizens' right to know. Without press freedom, without the diversity of media that I talked about, without the independence, the public itself does not have a diversity of of information, of sources of information, to make important decisions. And to only have one narrative, that of what the government wants you to hear, is obviously problematical. And that is why you see so many governments who are autocratic trying to ensure that the media space is actually made smaller and that you only have, for example, state media or media that they can control.
Now, you just mentioned that the public's right to know, but in recent times, we have also witnessed the public opposition to the press, because especially with the coming of the social media and other digital forms. How concerned is the Committee to Protect Journalists with this continuous opposition to the press by the general public?
So I think that the disconnect, the trust deficit between the media and the public is something that one needs to be very, very concerned about, and the Committee to Protect Journalists is concerned about. Of course, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You know, when we talk about the media not enjoying the public trust, you know, that's not necessarily the case throughout the continent, but there are certainly reason to be concerned. I mean, I think it was the Afrobarometer survey a couple of years back that said that for the first time, people were saying that they didn't believe that press freedom was necessary. So that of course is a concern. But how do you ensure that you get that trust back? I mean, it's quite clear that political leaders, including in the country that I am in currently, the United States, people like President Trump, have tried to demonize the press because they have something to hide, right? And so, you know, they need to find scapegoats to ensure that the attention is drawn away from whatever malfeasance that they are party to, or the abuse of power. So how do journalists then try and claw that back? I think you really need journalists to remain as professional as possible, to ensure that they are, in essence, but, you know, above reproach. It is important to also ensure that you do not lose contact with the public. You know, one thing that you see too much of, and again, not only on the continent, is this telephone journalism, sitting at the desk, you know, not being out in the community, not doing the stories that are relevant to the community. You know, going to social media and writing a news story about what someone is tweeting about. That's not journalism. So you do see credible journalism. And where there's credible journalism, you often have the public appreciating that and seeing how important it is for journalists to be able to be free and to continue. I come from South Africa. I've seen how investigative journalism in South Africa has assisted in ensuring that we expose corruption and that there is accountability. And we've seen it with the Commission of Inquiry into the former President Jacob Zuma's administration, and how it was held captive by a well-connected family. So all of these things are important. And when you see that, you suddenly see a sea change. And economically, media, you know, are facing major, major hurdles. Newsrooms are shutting down. Journalists are losing their jobs. And yet you see journalism thriving on the continent and elsewhere. And why is this? It's because there are members of the public who are prepared to invest in good journalism. And this is why you see investigative journalism doing the great work that is being done throughout the continent, often because of crowdfunding, because of ordinary citizens assisting and ensuring that they put money into ensuring that journalists are able to do their jobs. So as I keep on saying, it's not necessarily all bad news. That certainly we have seen that there is trust among some communities and the media, particularly when government has lost the trust of the very community that they purport to want to be part of.
All right, thank you very much there. Now, the theme of this year's World Freedom Day is focused on journalism under surveillance. I know that the past few weeks you've been working tirelessly to ensure that media professionals across the continent appropriate themselves to this particular theme. Can you break it down into context, the theme of this year's World Press Freedom Day?
So the theme is digital journalism under a digital siege, and I think that's a perfect description, siege, because that is what you are seeing. You see new technologies and how technology, while it may be good and has certainly been good for journalists, how it has actually also been abused. And how this has affected journalism and journalists and actually put their lives at risk. It's a very broad theme, but let me just point out, let's talk about the use of digital surveillance, where you have spyware being used to ensure that everything that journalists or activists are doing are actually surveyed, that the government can do this in such a way that a journalist, every move is being monitored without them necessarily knowing, okay? So the use of spyware, a major, major problem, and it does put people in danger. I mean, we saw it with Jamal Khashoggi when he was killed by the Saudis
Yeah.
while he was visiting
The Turkish
his
consulate.
consulate
Yeah.
in Turkey. You've seen it with Omar Radi in Morocco. That's another example of where that sort of technology and spyware is being used against journalists. And you see technology being weaponized against the press. So, a huge concern for CPJ is the fact that there is, in terms of online digital abuse, the bullying, the cyberbullying that you see, that affects particularly female journalists. It's a huge concern. I mean, you see the trolling of journalists, and you see how that affects journalists, not only mentally. Obviously, there's a lot of trauma involved, but when you see that sort of digital abuse happening in the cybersphere, you also know that it can happen in the physical. And so that is also a major concern. Then the other thing is the use of cybercrime laws, trying to ensure that good laws that are used, for example, to stop child porn or money laundering, is suddenly weaponized and used to shut down criticism and dissent. We saw it with anti-terror legislation. Obviously, you need legislation to combat anti-terrorism. We see it in your own country, in Cameroon.
Yeah.
You know, a law that is so broad, and we see it with cybercrime as well, the law is so broad that it can be abused, and it is then used to actually crack down on dissent. And that is a problem that we see with the cybercrime legislation. Many countries are using cybercrime laws, not only in Africa, the world over, to crack down on journalists to try and ensure that the truth does not get out. So false news laws. I mean, you've seen Cameroon, Egypt, a lot of that is being used. Why? People are using that because, yet again, they are abusing a system where, yes, you need the law, but because you feel that your own strength, your own power might be denuded, you need to ensure that you crack down on the press and that you crack down on dissent.
All right, you just spoke there about the government crackdown on the press, but recently there has been so much concern about the ownership of social media platforms. We just witnessed Elon Musk, who is the world's richest man, buying Twitter, Facebook, Meta, that has transformed to Meta, belonging to Mark Zuckerberg. Where do you think press freedom has a place in all of this? Do you fear that press freedom may be in danger?
Yes, very much so. I mean, and we see it just in terms of content moderation, for example. You see it in terms of privacy issues. You see it in the use of artificial intelligence. All of this is of concern. I mean, social media is certainly seen by governments as something that is a problem. Again, Cameroon, if I recall a couple of years back, I think it was the Speaker of your parliament who actually said that social media is a new form of terrorism. Mm-hmm. And so there is an attempt to control that space. And so when you get the wrong people owning social media platforms, it does put journalists and others and free speech at risk. So yes, there is a concern, definitely. But social media in itself has actually been of great use to journalists who have used that platform to continue their journalism. And that is why you'll see that governments are cracking down on social media, because it's offered a new space for free expression. So in Rwanda, for example, there's censorship, there's surveillance. Traditional media have effectively fallen in line. And so you've seen people move to social media as a space to express themselves freely and to do their journalism. And so Rwanda, as I mentioned to you, is actually the third worst jail of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's of interest that the majority of the journalists in jail in Rwanda are actually there because they are YouTubers, because they're practicing their journalism in social media. And so, yeah, there's always going to be an attempt to control social media. And what better way then, when you're an owner, to try and ensure that you use social media for your own ends and not necessarily for the public good.
Now, do you think and believe that journalists must also know and have knowledge on the new trends of cyber crime, as well as the crackdown on the media using internet and other cyber means? Do you really believe that journalists have to start getting interested into this particular domain in a bid to, stop some of the abuses that they face daily?
Very, very much so. I think the safety of journalists is paramount, and digital safety is key. I think that too often people still think about physical security, physical surveillance, and forget that we have now reached where we are talking about the pervasive use of technology for surveillance purposes. And journalists need to know what the threats are. So often you have a situation where something as simple as your telephone, where journalists use these tools, but do not take safeguards to protect the information that they have on these phones. And so when they get arrested and the police demand, their phones and their passwords, they're able to access all that information. And ultimately, who are you putting at risk? You're putting yourself, your colleagues, and your very sources at risk if you don't take those sort of measures. So CPJ and others have important tools on their websites to ensure that journalists have the information that they need to ensure that they protect themselves and they protect others. You cannot live in the year 2022 without understanding the way that technology is being used and abused and the threats that technology poses to freedom of expression and to press freedom.
All right. This year's World Press Freedom Day will also focus on the 10th anniversary of the UN Action Plan for the Safety of Journalists. I do understand that the Committee to Protect Journalists must have been very close to this particular instrument. Can you tell us how important is this action plan for the safety of journalists being to journalists, not only in Africa, but the world over?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's key. Anything that is going to help ensure that journalist safety and a commitment to journalist safety is something that we welcome, and it's key for their ability to do their work. But, I mean, actions speak louder than words. So we can have these things in place. But if member states of the United Nations themselves are guilty of the very thing that the UN Action Plan is asking for, which is to ensure the safety of journalists, then we have a problem, right? So
Sure.
It's in all our interests to ensure that the safety of journalists is paramount and to fight against when you do see that this is actually being ignored or actively worked against, including by governments themselves.
All right. I was doing my research and I discovered that in September 2021, the Free Press Unlimited Reporters Without Borders, as well as the Committee to Protect Journalists, created the People's Tribunal. This is a tribunal which decries the abuses of government on journalists. Can you tell us how effective this has been to, safeguard the protection of journalists in Africa?
So it's early days, right? I mean, I think I need to understand what the People's Tribunal is. Is really, it's a form of grassroots justice, and it has a legal foundation in international law. If you look at impunity in crimes against journalists, if you look at impunity in the murder of journalists, often you'll see that governments, and I think more than 80% of journalist murders, there's no accountability. There's complete impunity. So what you've seen in terms of the People's Tribunal is really a way, I think, to ensure that you highlight what is happening and that there can be accountability. And in essence, you actually shaming governments into doing something in terms of ensuring that there is no impunity. So it's also hopefully that the work that you've seen that is happening will actually serve as a model then for NGOs and press freedom groups and reporters in countries themselves to use that to demand justice for journalists. So, I mean, it's early days, but it is certainly a way to highlight the fact that governments themselves are not actually doing the work that they should be doing in ensuring that there is no impunity.
And you just spoke about the People's Tribunal. Is it a tribunal only for journalists, or is being used to also raise public awareness on the crimes against journalists, so that these people may put the pressure on government for these crimes to stop?
Spot on, Peter. You're right. Obviously, it's not only for journalists, because remember, journalists are not the species that is separate to people. Journalists are citizens, and citizens are journalists. It's not as though it's something that we have a special place. The reason that there are journalists is ultimately, as I tried to say, is that the public benefits because it is citizens who have the right to know. It is citizens who have the fundamental human right to access information. And without journalists, that becomes harder. But ultimately, we're talking about the public that will benefit. And so when you see action being taken in this way, certainly it raises awareness amongst the public itself. And that is very important. Just to say, and I think I always say it's the canary in the coal mine, right? Once you see journalists being targeted, then you know that it's going to be citizens next. A good example is what was happening in Cameroon. In late 2016, when we saw what was going on there, we were looking at how journalists were being arrested, how they were being detained. And that was really a sign, the Committee to Protect Journalists, that things were falling apart and that we were going to see repression. And look at this. All these years down the line, the situation has got worse. And it started with journalists and activists actually being targeted by the government in the way that we saw in Cameroon.
All right. Now, let's look at the role of journalism associations. Over the years, journalism associations in Africa have always, campaigned for press freedom. But despite their actions, just as you mentioned, the picture is extremely grim from the continent. Do you think that the inability for these journalism associations to carry out their campaign is linked to maybe lack of information or lack of professional knowledge on what they ought to do?
So let me say that, journalist associations and unions are key to ensuring that there is press freedom. When you have, weak associations, it really does mean that there isn't internal scrutiny. And that really is important because ultimately you need journalists themselves to be their best defenders, right? It shouldn't be others who are doing the defending. And that's why it's so important to have associations. And that is how CPJ works. We really do count on people with knowledge on the ground. It's the unions themselves, it's the associations that are in a position to say what is a problem, what isn't a problem, and how this should actually be used, how one should solve it. So the stronger the association, the stronger the union, the better it is for press freedom and for everyone. I think part of the problem, though, is that often associations get caught up in internal conflicts, in competition with other associations, and you don't see the cooperation that should be there, because the fight for press freedom is something that everyone should be involved in. This isn't a competition. And unfortunately, there's often, and not only in Africa, but often you see this competition between associations, and that shouldn't be the case. The other thing, of course, is also you have associations that are taken over by a particular clique, who then effectively become leaders for life of these associations, which also isn't particularly good. I mean, if we are fighting against undemocratic practices in governments, then we should also be looking at undemocratic practices in our own associations. And I think that is one of the barriers that we may have in some instances.
Now, you worked in South Africa for many years, and now you're working in New York with the Committee to Protect Journalists. What best practices can journalists, particularly those working in very severe environments, learn from your experience in South Africa? It should be noted that you were the presidential reporter during the time of Nelson Mandela, and you must have witnessed the apartheid and then the post-apartheid period, particularly that period. What lessons should African journalists learn from your time?
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. I think if I look at South African media today, the one thing that I think is a lesson that others can learn from, and that is the fact that there is a very strong system of self-regulation. And that's, a strong ombudsman, so that it comes to issues of ethics, that journalists are held accountable, but they are being held accountable through their own working with the public, as opposed to being held accountable by a government, which is a no-no. So the self-regulation system that we see being used in South Africa is something that I'd like to see being emulated elsewhere. I mean, we do see it in some other countries. Namibia also has something similar, as opposed to the government-regulated system. But I also want to turn it around and say there's much that we in South Africa can learn from others. I mean, we are a democracy that has been, we're still quite young in comparison to others in Africa. And I guess the one thing that we can learn from others is this whole issue of not becoming complacent, okay? Because as we've seen elsewhere, with the fact that you have governments in place who are our liberators, then become the dictators. And where they may have been pro, access to information and pro media, they suddenly turn and they're no longer that. And you see inroads into that very freedom that was fought for being made. And then you have the pushback. So I think in that sense, complacency is out of the window. You may have good court systems, but you know that may not last. You may have a good government, but there's always the case that it may not last. Let me use the example of where you think that something is going to be good, that there will be reforms, as we saw in Ethiopia. And in a matter of 3 years, you're back to square one. So the complacency that we have is something that needs to be guarded against. And certainly journalists throughout will tell us, as South African journalists, it's not always going to be this way. It may be rosy, but depending on who's going to be in power, things may turn just like that.
All right. Now, when you look at the African continent, most regional economic communities are focused on political and economic issues. The media has been relegated to to the background. This explains why, of course, we have so many journalists that are working under the impunity of the government. Do you think that the regional economic communities can do more to press their governments to respect their freedoms?
Oh, no doubt about it. And, you know, it's quite interesting. You know, there's certain regional groupings that are far stronger when it comes to this than others. So, you know, the Southern African Development Community, with respect, is hopeless. I mean, it doesn't even have a court now that citizens are able to petition when their own domestic courts are not giving them the relief that they seek. So if I look at something like ECOWAS, you know, or even the East African Community, you actually have a system there where the courts themselves are actually upholding fundamental freedoms and the rights of journalists and press freedom. Of course, it's all very well having courts then coming out with these sort of judgments against governments. But if the governments themselves who are party to this are not going to accept the rulings, then we have a problem. So I think that, you know, with the AU as well, we've got special rapporteurs on freedom of expression who do fantastic jobs. We have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. But ultimately, you have member states that are continuing to do the very things that these bodies are warning against. So if the member states themselves do not respect these rulings and decisions that are being made, you have a problem. If you have governments who see that things are happening in a neighboring country and are not actually trying to ensure that they put a stop to this, you know, it's not going to work. And I think, unfortunately, too often it is a boys' club, everyone looking after their own backs as leaders and forgetting the citizens. Yeah, but certainly there is far greater room, I think, for regional groupings to ensure that they do uphold the fundamental rights of citizens generally.
All right, before we go, just tell us what pressmen in Africa should be looking up to the Committee to Protect Journalists beyond the World Press Freedom Day as you continue your activism.
So, you know, for us, it's important for us to be guided by journalists themselves in the region. And the Africa program is such that we have a relationship where it's the journalists who will be the ones to tell us what is going on, to tip us off. It's associations that will lead us in the advocacy that we take. So we always welcome people communicating with us and being in a position to tip us off. So, you know, we have a very good website. Our contact details are there if people need to contact CPJ, and they can do so also in such a way that if they are concerned about their privacy, about the fact that governments may find the fact that they're contacting CPJ as a problem and hold it against them. You know, there are ways of doing this without exposing yourself. So that is something. And then if I could just say, there is a lot of good material on CPJ's website. Not only good material that will make good stories for journalists who are interested in what is happening throughout the region in terms of press freedom, but also important tools. And as I said to you, tools for the safety of journalists. If they go on, they will see that there's a lot of important information that they should be using to ensure that they protect themselves. And it's all there on our website, cpj.org.
Thank you very much, Angela Quintal. It was a massive pleasure to hear from you. Your insight, I would say, will go a long way to enable journalists navigate through the difficult socio-political environments which they work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
And to you, televiewers, thank you very much for being with us. That was Angela Quintal, the African Programs Coordinator of the Committee to Protect Journalists, one of the strong bodies fighting for the interests of journalists, particularly when it comes to journalist safety and protection. of the media in Africa and across the world. And it was a pleasure having you on this edition of the program. Until next time, keep watching Dash News. Bye-bye.